So you want to know which skills are good or bad in Dead Cells? Well, you come to the right place. I'm just kidding though, we don't need to go over the criteria of my ratings a third time since I already gone through it in my melee tier list, so let's just skip the boring stuff and get right into the ratings. The Barnacle is a recently reworked turret that also crits on poison targets now. Since it's always out of reach from enemies, it will never get destroyed. Now, I'm generally gonna give higher ratings for turrets because of their sustained damage, and honestly, the Barnacle is starting to look pretty competitive. Although it's, in my opinion, not the best turret in the game, it's still fairly decent. With the poison rework, it can do some work given the right builds and affixes. On 5BC, poison is pretty common to come by. Plus, the constant crits, assuming that you can pull it off, synergizes with a lot of things. Used to suck, but now, a promotion to A- is in order. Now we're talking. The Cleaver is an excellent skill in applying the bleed status. You just plop this baby down, and everything that wanders on top of it just gets shredded. Now, given that this is the second turret in this list, I'll quickly go over why turrets just have an advantage as skills. So when you use a skill, something I ask myself is, how much value is that skill generating for me until the cooldown resets? In the case with a lot of them, there is a set limit on how much impact a skill has. Say that a grenade will do 200 damage. That means every time it's thrown, 200 damage is the most amount of damage it will ever deal. Turrets, on the other hand, will continue to deal damage as long as it's on the field. Its potential is a lot higher than some of the other skills in the game, and what's more weird is that some of the best turrets in Dead Cells have shorter cooldowns than the grenades. And the Cleaver is one of them. 8 seconds is like nothing when you can use cooldown mutations, and that's not including any value that the Cleaver generates while it's still active. Now that's what I call busted. The Cleaver is essentially Brutality's ace in the hole, and for that, it's an S tier turret. The Clussy Grenade has one major shortfall that makes it somewhat inferior to the other grenades. Its enormous spread. While it's useful for mowing down those pesky rats on a platform, it leaves little to be desired against those rats that are not so small, and are not actually rats. Since the damage is spread out, you don't have a lot of control when it comes to dealing with bigger targets. Plus, the 20-second cooldown is a little too much in my opinion. Sure, you can try grouping up the cluster by standing near a wall, but I don't think skills should require that much setup. I'll use it as a placeholder, but there are better options out there. B for Clussy. I personally love the design of the Cocoon. It's a backup defensive option if your loadout happens to take up both of your weapon slots, and you really want a shield. Now, given that the parries on the Cocoon works a little differently than shields, you'll need to adjust your timings a bit. That being said, while it does go into cooldown if you miss a parry, the window on it is generously long. Plus, it can actually parry attacks that normally can't be parried by shields. You essentially become the skill itself, the Cocoon. You're pretty much impenetrable if you can constantly parry with this. The only thing is that you can't chain parries together really fast, and it can't really be used if you're locked in place while attacking with your weapon. I don't use this often, but I really appreciate that it is in the game. A tier for Cocoon. Corrosive Cloud is a little disappointing in terms of how much impact it has when you use it. I think they fixed the problem where only one instance of bleed and poison can be applied at a time. But even then, the DOT effects come into play so slowly, you really can't expect much out of it when you deploy this. It's okay when dealing with those explosive bats, since they'll just die in one hit anyways, or just whittle everything down in its range, but a 20-second cooldown? That's a little extra. I certainly don't mind this as a placeholder now, but there are vastly better skills out there. C tier for the Cloud. Corrupted Power. Corrupted Power. Where do I even start with this? It's freaking good. In my last tier list on ranged weapons, I talked about how Hokuto's bow stepped down as a damage catalyst, and in its place, a phoenix rises from the ashes. Having Corrupted Power active is like making the beheaded take steroids. Ever since its rework, the damage bonus is now percentage-based instead of a flat bonus. While it doesn't work with DOT effects to my knowledge, any damage it can boost is absolutely disgusting. So disgusting, you can literally one-shot bosses. The difference between having it on versus not on is night and day. Enemies that need a couple of shots to kill only takes a single hit from the boomerang to get deleted from existence. The extra damage you take really doesn't matter because you're not going to be taking any damage. Since the 50% damage boost is innate, you can use it in any color. On top of that, even though the cooldown reads 16 seconds, It's realistically only 8 seconds because the cooldown starts right when you use it, and the effect lasts for 8 seconds. With cooldown mutations, it's practically nothing. Even with a 6th tier corrupted power, it's able to even turn mediocre weapons into superstars. Try this one out when you got the chance. It is an absolute game changer now. The CP gets an S+. Wait a minute. The Crusher is a pretty vital tool in the survival arsenal. Given its ability to stun-lock foes, it's what enables some slow-hitting weapons to shine greatly, especially in bosses. However, now that the slowdown is less effective, you do have to be a bit more careful now. But even then, for the amount of work it does, it is insane for only 14 seconds of cooldown. Basically, anything that gets caught is unable to attack you, so you can guarantee some hits if your setup requires it. It fills in a big gap in the defenses for survival players, and even with a nerf, I can still give this one S tier. The Death Orb is rather underwhelming as a skill in general. The problem isn't that the damage is too slow. On the contrary, it can be quite good if you can use it well. It's that in order to hit enemies multiple times, you need to place it so that enemies won't move while they are in the orb, which is very hard to do. Sure, you could use stuff like Boy's Axe or Wolf Trap to keep them in place, but in my opinion, skills should make it more convenient for your weapons to get better, not the other way around. I can see it being run in some freeze or root comps, but overall it's a more than capable placeholder. Bonus points for being an offensive survival skill. My suggestion is to make it home in on enemies. So far, this one goes in B tier. The double Cross-o-Matic is pretty vanilla as a turret can get, but given how powerful turrets are, I've mentioned previously, it's still pretty strong. How vanilla is too vanilla? Well, the double cross shoots stuff, and it does damage. And I like it when turrets do that. With a modest 10-second cooldown, it's bound to generate some value for you, especially with some good affixes. The lack of AoE hurts it a little bit, but it's still the old reliable B tier turret. Now, I know I just said that turrets are generally strong, but the door is the one exception. It puts down a door. That's it. It does a whopping 1 damage. On top of that, a whole 10 seconds for this extremely underwhelming effect. The obvious combo is with Crowbar, but aside from that, I question whether or not this can even be used as a placeholder. I just don't know what you can do with it. Even after 4 years, I don't believe it got buffed. The only realistic change I would make is that I would just decrease its cooldown. Like, by a lot. For now, it stays in D tier. The Decoy has received a buff in a recent patch. Now, you can detonate it manually before it runs out of health. While you get a little bit more freedom when it explodes, you still have to wait 3 seconds before the self-detonate option becomes available. Obviously, this is to prevent you from just detonating it right away like a grenade, because I will admit, if the Decoy actually lands its damage, it gets pretty insane. However, a 20-second cooldown? Given that it's tactics only, it's pitted against a lot of competition vying for the skill slots. While I would take it when lifting curses if I got one for free, but because the invisibility will go away as soon as you attack, if you whiff the explosion, it's pretty awkward. But if you do land it, the damage can absolutely shred. And for that potential, a B+ for the Decoy. The Phase Flask is a skill that does nothing but deal 5 damage to yourself? Well, how can that ever be good? Well, aside from landing some good affixes, it's used in combination with the Vengeance mutation, and shines especially well in Spite Sword builds. When it first released, it was the most busted thing ever, being able to recover health alongside its damaging effect. And for a second, I thought Brutality would actually become the strongest color in the game. But then it got nerfed. Currently, it comes down to personal preference whether or not you want to use it, but health is pretty scarce in 5BC. If you're at 30% health with no flasks, are you really willing to deal even more damage to yourself? The way I see it, it's like a win more skill now. Do you already have busted affixes and synergies? Just pick this one up, and in boss fights, you become the boss. I would say the power level is somewhat on par with Corrupted Power. Given all it does is deal 5 damage to yourself, you can also use it in any color you want. But because it's slightly more situational, I'm gonna have to just put this in normal S tier. The fire grenade is kinda like the powerful grenade, except it inflicts fire and the effect isn't as instant. While the solution it provides isn't as fast as some other skills that do burst damage, the fire grenade is still very potent at inflicting burn, and its potential to just roast enemies while being in complete safety is a plus when doing curse chests. Sometimes I don't understand how the cooldown on the skills are determined because 13 seconds is very reasonable for this grenade. Press L2 and just watch your foes burn in front of you. It's an A-tier grenade. The Flamethrower Turret boasts the only turret in the game that always inflicts the burn status. While it's easy to get on some affixes, fire is actually one of the rarer status effects in the game. Coupled with oil sources, its potential can get pretty insane. While I don't think it quite reaches the level of a certain other turret that we will see later, wink wink, it still holds up incredibly well. While it's slightly more expensive at the cost of 12 seconds to deploy rather than 10, 2 seconds is still a good price to pay for such a good effect. S-tier turret. The Giant's Whistle is really good if it actually hits the target you want it to hit. It's possibly the best single target skill in the game. The Giant only decides to fist a target that he decides on. There's no way you can predict it, but it seems to prioritize bigger enemies. One wrongly timed press and you might just be sending a small rat to the Shadow Realm instead of an elite standing right next to you. It's frustrating when it doesn't work, but quite decent when it does. Due to its random nature, I'll have to put it as a B. No one really knows how the mind works inside that behemoth's head. Get over here, because the Grappling Hook is like the alternative solution to the phaser. Instead of teleporting to enemies, it grabs them to where you are instead. Supplemented by a short cooldown, you can spam this out pretty frequently. Because of the damage boost, it's actually really potent as a burst damage option. Just gotta think about what you pair it up with. Very solid damage catalyst. Gets a solid A. There are a few skills in the game where I can just put into S tier without much explanation, and the Owl is one of them. A turret that follows you around and never disappears? Now that's value. Sure, the caveat is that you can't get hit, but with the support this gives you, it's harder to get hit. It covers a lot of your weaknesses in the run, especially in the early game. Even though they added numerous pets into the game, the Owl is still the close contender for the winner. I see the heavy turret as being rather interchangeable with the double cross. Both deal damage, both have 10 seconds on the cooldown, just generally good turrets. Now I will mention that the heavy turret will stun on its hits and gives you a damage boost when you're near it. So I can see how some range setups will benefit from this rather than other turrets. It's very solid, especially when you pair up with the mutation that gives you extra damage when you're near a turret. Personally, I actually hold this in rather high regards. So for that, I'll give it A-. Ice Armor is a skill where it looks really underwhelming, but when it works, you're like, damn, am I glad I had Ice Armor active. It protects you in lifting curses and adds a safety net in boss fights. In fact, some glass cannon builds just run this off-color for its effect. I've actually made a small montage of the times when Ice Armor saved me. It's honestly an incredible skill. Its effect is very unique, unlike any other skill I've ever seen, but might be a little hard to utilize unless you actually try it out. It's almost like a parry on demand. The next time you feel a little dip in your confidence, the Ice Armor's got you covered. S tier for such a cool defensive option. The Ice Grenade is pretty self-explanatory. It freezes stuff. I will admit, it does very solid job at freezing foes on demand, but in a world where Frost Blast exists, the Ice Grenade is essentially that effect, but every 18 seconds. Any limitations for the freeze archetype still applies to this little ice box, so bosses won't be too fazed by it. And the resulting cooldown can be a little annoying. It's not bad at all when it comes to doing the one thing that it does. The only problem is, why would you want to freeze the enemy when you can just instantly delete them with Powerful Grenade? C for situational. The Infantry Grenade appears rather underwhelming, but there is a little bit of redeeming quality with it. While the damage is quite mediocre, the short cooldown somewhat makes up for it. In builds that utilize Phaser or Grappling Hook, pairing it up with the Scheme mutation can make it fairly decent. The only problem is that outside of these scenarios, I see very little reason to use this. It feels rather bad when the effect of a skill is so little. While I do see some potential in that regard, I'll have to leave the Infantry Grenade at B-. Knife Dance is kinda like the Powerful Grenade, in the sense that it's a button press to solve all of your problems. It's the premier choice when applying instant bleed with some decent upkeep. It's as close as a blood grenade as it gets. If you manage to land a good portion of the knives, the bleed is able to do so much damage to stuff, including bosses. It's a skill that can actually single-handedly melt enemies in front of you. That's insane. S tier for the knife dance. The Lacerating Aura is like the bane of early game enemies' existence. While its usefulness tapers off a bit later on, the aura is able to fill in gaps in your defenses quite well. Say you're running a Warpan build, and you can't deal with those biters in the sewers given the frying pan's short range. Well, just pop this and there's no need to worry. It's a more than capable tool of handling everything that you have trouble with, and with a modest 12-second cooldown, it lands at a very decent A tier. The Leghugger is an unfortunate case among the pets. Being the 4th pet released into the game, you really gotta wonder how they can design a new one to keep things fresh. Well, this one ain't it, chief. This little sea urchin will lick things and stack bleed statuses. If you press the pet skill button, it would expand its body in a wave of spikes, dealing crits to anything that has bleed. If it licks enough, it will grow into an adult state. And thanks to a recent buff, the adult state is retained across every Leghugger you find in the run. Sounds good, right? Well, not exactly. The reason why the owl is so good is that it does its magic without having you to do anything. The Leghugger, on the other hand, doesn't quite do that. The damage and the speed that it does it is so slow you probably already finished off the opponents and moved on. It lags behind your movements so hard, you literally need to pay attention to it constantly to actually make it generate value. Half the time it might as well not even be there. The sustained bleed can be good in bosses, but in the other 95% of the run, not so much. The only saving grace is that it's a cute little thing. Just look how adorable it is. C- though. The Lightning Rod is quite interesting. You plop it down at 2 different locations, and it will shock anything in between. Though I find that most of the time, I just happen to spam it twice and make it go boom right away. For a tactics skill, the damage is definitely on par with how much it needs to do to be competitive. While I don't think it's the best option out there, it still provides very solid work. Not only does it do some burst damage, it also applies the shock DLT that lasts a pretty good while. I wouldn't mind at all using this. It's a B tier skill. Lightspeed has a fascinating gimmick. You can use this skill button to dash forward, then again to dash back. You can probably pull some shenanigans with stuff like blowgun or tentacle with the movement manipulation, but it seems really complex to pull off. 99% of the time, I'm just spamming the skill button to do some damage and then move on. The short cooldown is very enticing, though I can't really see it any more than a placeholder. C for the Lightspeed. The Magnetic Grenade was recently reworked. Now it will suck in anything within a radius and then explode, dealing electric damage a bit later. I'm not sure how I feel about this rework. While I do admit the old version was a little wonky since enemies could just break out of it, but now you don't actually get the electric status right away. Since it's a tactics-only skill, it's pitted against some serious competition. But on a good day, it's still fairly good at stalling bosses and deflecting bombs. It's a little bit more annoying to use from its old version, so for that reason, I'm giving it B tier. The Mushroom Boy is the OG of the DLC pets. Its ability is to knock things away from you, at least some of the time. The frustrating thing about this is that when you want to land some hits with your weapon, the Mushroom Boy can just knock them away. When you're preparing to parry, nope, out goes your timings. Alright, Mushroom Boy, let me parry this enemy. Alright, Mushroom Boy, knock this elite away from me. Yeah, that's a problem. However, I can still see some scenarios where you don't really care whether or not Mushroom Boy works and just want some occasional knockback, such as in the case if you're running the explosive crossbow. You'll definitely need to think whether or not you actually get benefit from employing this little friend, but it's not completely hopeless. If only the knockback was a little bit more consistent. Mushroom Boy stays at C tier. The oil grenade is good at what it does, but without fire synergy, there are better grenades out there. It's a skill that practically makes itself. Do you have a fire-based build? Then it's very good. In other cases, not that good. Decent damage and the 10-second cooldown is always nice to see. It's still good enough to be taken as a placeholder, but I don't see it as any much more than that unless you have the right synergies. Oil is already so readily accessible in this game. B tier for the Oil Grenade. Just like the Grappling Hook, Phaser is a very good support skill with select weapons, namely the Assassin's Dagger and the Blowgun. Even outside of that, the burst damage potential from the multiplier is always nice. I'll complement the same as the hook, and I think it's fairly interchangeable between the two. It's very helpful in general to be able to close in on enemies on demand. Pick your poison. A+, same as the hook. Pollo Power is weird. Without a doubt, it's one of the most creative abilities in the game, but rather restricting in how you can use it. Once you're a chicken, you can't control the rate of laying your eggs, nor can you cancel the ability. There's a damage multiplier for every subsequent egg you land on enemies, so if you land them all, it's fantastic. The only problem is, you are a sitting duck. Well, I guess chicken in this case. When you're in Pollo mode, enemies can still target and hit you. You don't have any way to defend yourself other than jumping. Being a tactics-only skill, you'll be taking a lot of damage if you get hit. The only change I will make is to just let players cancel out of chicken mode by pressing the skill button again. They've already done this with Ice Armor and the Explosive Decoy, so I don't see how it can't be done here. I would use the current version of the Pollo Power at your own risk, because it is not an easy skill to use. C tier. The Powerful Grenade provides a very simple solution to pretty much any problems you're dealing with. Long story short, the damage this does is insane enough to one-shot any normal monster in the game. You press the button, and your problem is solved. Enemies don't stand a chance against this miniature nuke. You can almost think of it as a panic button, one that recovers every 13 seconds. It's the old Oonga Boonga solution, and it's very effective. A tier grenade. Just like the Ice Grenade, the Root Grenade has a very specialized use. While I don't deny the solid rooting potential in some biomes, I'll ask the same question again. Why would you want to root enemies instead of just getting rid of them right away with the Powerful Grenade? Ironically, the Powerful Grenade has a shorter cooldown, so I'll rate it the same way as the Ice Grenade, so it stays at C tier. The Scarecrow Sickles is probably the skill in the game that requires the most amount of, well, skill. When you launch your two blades, they'll revolve around you at an awkward angle and will continue to deal crits if you can keep them going without catching them. It's unique in the sense that you can hit stuff one platform above or below you, but if you're not careful with your movement, you won't be dealing much damage with it at all. Depending on who you give this to, they can either be juggling with the Sickles for hours or never reaching its full potential. And I am the latter. I'm going to give this an A, but because you can master the way of the Sickles, you're more than welcome to rate this higher and lower. If the Scavenged Bombard was a tactics-only item, I would have tossed it to the lower half of the tier list. But thankfully it's not. New to the game, this little portable cannon will fire and occasionally stun nearby enemies, dealing a lot of damage. The main appeal of the cannon isn't in its effect, but rather what color it belongs to. Survival builds historically have been lacking in the skills department. There are very few survival skills that are just generally good. Stuff like the Giant's Whistle and Powerful Grenade are certainly very welcome, but they're limited to pretty infrequent uses. The Bombard, on the other hand, you just plop this hunk of metal down, and it's gonna keep giving you value. Sure, stuff like Wolf Trap and Crusher have always been in the game, but they really enable you to do more damage instead. Just because of the merit that the Scavenged Bombard filling in a very important gap in survival skills, this turret gets the rank of A tier. Alright, we move on to the last of the pets. Serenade will mark enemies on its own, and once you equip it, it deals crits to anything that are marked, as well as reset its cooldown. If you don't use it every 30 seconds, the Serenade will disappear. In terms of pet gameplay, you really have to pay attention to your little friend, because the damage it does is pretty substantial, though you really want it to keep going. I personally go on and off about this pet. It's quite decent if you actually commit to using it, and overall it's actually my second favorite pet in the game, landing at an impressive A tier. You've probably picked up the Sinew Slicer a couple times in your first runs, and even to this day, it's still fairly decent. Similarly to the Cleaver, the Slicer inflicts the bleed status very often. While I do think it's a little outclassed by Cleaver, just being it from pretty fragile sometimes, the turret itself still pulls its weight. Despite its early design and Dead Cell's lifespan, it's still solid sitting at A tier. Smoke Bomb used to be a busted machine when killing bosses, being able to scale damage way more than it's supposed to. But now, not so much. Ever since they nerfed the scaling, they pretty much patched the one situation it was good for. I honestly thought it was pretty balanced before. You can only use it in bosses, and it only works with select weapons. Now you can get invisibility and get the drop on one enemy, and then the effect is over. With a 16-second cooldown, that's really underwhelming. I can see myself using it if I got one for free when lifting curses to make my life a little easier, but other than that, I can't see much use for it now. C- for the Smoke Bomb, unfortunately. Here we go again, because the Stun Grenade is here to stun you with how abhorrently bad it is. First of all, it does very little damage. Second, the stun status almost has no synergies in the game. And plus, stunning bosses is almost never happening. To add insult to injury, the cooldown is the same as the powerful grenade. I'll still take it as an early placeholder, but this thing is seriously getting replaced as soon as possible. Some normal enemies are even immune to stun. I don't know if there's a way to use it well. All I know is the stun grenade is stunningly bad. D tier skill. The Swarm skill has received a buff recently to its inhabitants. The biters that come out of it are now more resistant to damage, and 8 come out instead of 4. The thing is that I don't think biters are very helpful in general. When I use a skill, especially in tactics, I want to see its impact right away. Even assuming that the biters will stick around a little and actually chip some health away from enemies, the process just takes so long I probably have already killed the enemies and moved on. They might as well be tickling enemies with the mediocre damage. Just because you have 8 back scratchers doesn't change the fact that you're still scratching the enemy's back instead of actually doing damage. It's a good try at a buff, but I've been letting this remain at D tier. I just don't personally enjoy using it. The Telluric Shock is what it feels to have an upgraded version of the Ram rune. Anything on the ground is pretty much eviscerated when you do the slam. It's a skill I'm happy to see in the early game, but I find skills that manipulate movement a little iffy since you can't be 100% sure where you'll actually slam down. As a survival skill, better ones exist, but this one isn't so bad. B+. I probably don't even need any explanation for the Tesla Coil. Massive range, huge DOT damage, it pretty much does everything for you. It's the only reason to go into the distillery to get the blueprint for this beast of a skill and then never go back to that cursed place again. Even on a rainy day, Tesla Coil's got your back. It operates on a whole different realm from the rest of us mortals. It wouldn't even be unreasonable to say that it's objectively the best turret in the game. S+ tier skill. Need I say more? The Tonic is a sad case. In the past, it had a hidden ability to give you a speed boost, but now that ability has been transferred to Vampirism, so the Tonic will give you some temporary health, and that's it. I can see some cases where if you're running Spite Sword, you can use it to take damage without affecting your actual health, but the Face Flask in my opinion just does it better now. I'm racking my head in the ways you can use it, but nothing's really coming up. On top of that, a 30-second cooldown? Yikes. I don't understand why they had to take away the speed boost because that at least makes it slightly more tolerable. Sadly, this one falls all the way down to C tier. The Tornado will suck in everything in its path, enemies and bombs alike. It's fairly decent at clearing out a platform of mobs, or on 4/5 BC you can just aggro mobs teleport to you right into the Tornado's path. The only problem is though, you can't really control whether or not the tornado will stun every enemy. Sometimes if enemies just decide to attack while they're still spinning inside this tornado, they will still do so. It adds some protection against some bosses' bomb attacks, but on an 18-second cooldown, we can do better than that. Overall, I don't mind taking this as a placeholder now, but as a tactics skill, there are better options. C tier. Here we go. So I don't quite understand why some people banter about how the Vampirism is a good skill now. It's not. While I do think there are some fringe scenarios where it can be used given the recent rework, the risk vastly outweighs the reward. First of all, the skill no longer returns your missing HP into recovery. You sacrifice a percentage of your health to give yourself the Health Leech ability for 10 seconds. You will recover HP for every hit you deal on enemies. So let's take a look at the criteria. In order to get value out of it, you'll need to 1. Be on low health to begin with, since there is no reason to put yourself at risk when your HP is sitting comfortably. 2. You're pressured to play faster in order to not let the leech ability go to waste. 3. You're potentially putting yourself at risk of being one-shotted if it's active. 4. You'll actually need enough enemies to show up in order to keep leeching. And 5. When you're not using it, it's essentially bricking one of your skill slots that could have been used to do more damage. Realistically, how many times are you going to use the skill? I can't see scenarios where you're constantly purposefully getting hit just to get value out of Vampirism. What would happen if you think that an area will have lots of enemies, only to find 3 of them, and now you wasted a good portion of the leech ability? Your focus on 5BC should be avoiding damage altogether. Getting hit often just so you can benefit from Vampirism is just not a good mindset to have. Yes, I'm not denying that it can give you a full heal if the situation was just right. And the only time where I would think about using it is if I just saw it, deciding to use it once and then just scrap it. So that potential is there at least. And just for that, I'll put it in D+, because I think it barely has any good uses, but I don't think I can have it any higher. Here is the premier knockback skill in the game. The Wave Denial lets you knock back anything within a radius, enemies and bombs. Should enemies hit a wall, they will be dealt extra damage, and in most cases it will just kill them altogether. It's also good for knocking back bombs on demand. Remember Tornado? This is the improved version. It doesn't see much, but for such a powerful effect on a 5-second cooldown, that's just insane. It's one of the best biome clearing skills in the game to this day, clocking in at a comfortable A+. If you watch my video on the range tier list, Wings of the Crow is what enables a lot of cheesy strategies involving the magic missiles. Even without it, most enemies that get shocked below can't even target you, making it very easy to get kills for curses. Mobility on the other hand isn't too good. The jumping animation breaks quite a bit, and you'll find movement so wonky, your best bet is just cover at walking speed. The damage upkeep is impressive, and you can cancel out of the crow state at any time. I've definitely reconsidered my thoughts on it, but its potential raises it to a B tier. The Wolf Trap gets to shine as possibly the only skill in the game that can reliably root bosses, and at a reasonable duration at that. Given that some of the status effects don't nearly work as well in bosses, the Wolf Trap provides a much-needed solution for some synergies to work, like the Nutcracker or the Shark. While the cooldown of 14 seconds may seem long, but given that you're most likely running Heart of Ice, it's really not that bad. Very consistent at what it does, and a very good support skill for some rooting setups. Plus you do some extra damage while enemies are rooted. S- tier to end it off. Alright, here we have it. It's been a long and strange journey, but thanks for sticking with me until the end. Here we conclude the entirety of my 3.0 tier lists. Hopefully you found them to be entertaining to watch. Again, my tier lists are purely subjective, so you don't have to agree with anything. That being said, this has been the most difficult series of videos to make on my channel, so if you would kindly leave a like on the video, it would really help me out. Aside from that, leave anything you have to say in the comments. I would love to hear from you. So, until then, thanks for sticking by, and I'll see all of you later.